Who is Jesus? I have no idea who Jesus is.
I don't know if it exists, but I believe in him.
I think it's a person who lived ages ago.
Who is Jesus? He is the Son of God in the Christian faith.
Jesus for me is also a prophet. He probably was just some fella who walked around with a beard and and a bottle of wine in his back pocket and switched the water with the wine a couple of times, and everyone loved him.
Jesus to me is somebody we got taught about in infants and junior school, really.
There's how many millions of people celebrating his birthday. No one celebrates my birthday like that, so surely he must have existed.
Jesus is my God.
He's someone that, I can relate to, I can pray to, I can talk to.
The Son of God, but apparently we are all God's children. So then what is so great about Jesus?
I was born and bred in a beautiful town just north of London called Luton. And I love Luton. I always feel like I have to apologise for my hometown. And I think it's because Luton is one of those places which at first glance appears to have very few redeeming features. But let me tell you, when you scratch beneath the surface, you find it has none, actually. But it's my hometown, and I love it. I'm very passionate about Luton, and I'm very fond of it. And actually, my parents had been missionaries in China before I was born, and they moved back to the UK. And so faith and church were a part of my life from a very young age. But then when I went to high school, I went to our local high school, which was in a particularly rough area of Luton and was a particularly rough high school. It was actually known as the worst school in Luton, which is actually quite a difficult accolade to achieve. You have to try quite hard to win that label. And actually, it was what these days you would call a failing school, largely because it failed. Ofsted eventually got fed up with it and they shut it down, and they actually ended up bulldozing it. So I brought along, just to prove it, an action shot from the demolition. The first classroom to go was actually my classroom, which I tried to take not too personally. But I learned a lot at that school about all sorts of things, actually, and I loved my time there. But when I arrived there, I realized quite quickly that I was one of only 2 or 3 out of 800 students, only one of 2 or 3 who had any kind of faith or went to church. And it suddenly hit me that you didn't have to believe all this stuff that my parents had passed on to me and taught me about. I suddenly realized that lots of people didn't believe these things and didn't have anything to do with it. And at the same time, all my friends at church stopped coming to church, and it forced me to work out for myself what I really believed about Jesus. And there came a point where I had to make a decision based on the evidence. Is this stuff I've been brought up with real? Is it true? I couldn't just believe something that wasn't true. I couldn't just put my head in the sand and pretend it was true. I couldn't take some kind of blind jump of faith. I needed some evidence. For me personally, evidence has always been very important. After Luton, I went on to read law at Oxford, and actually I studied and worked as a lawyer for 10 years. I worked as a barrister defending and prosecuting people accused of crimes. And so every case I worked on, the first question was always, what is the evidence about the events? What's the evidence about what's going on here? How does the case stack up? And the question I asked every day for years at work was, what is the evidence? And when it comes to who Jesus is, I'm convinced by the evidence. But what evidence is there? Well, you can't prove Christianity mathematically. You can't prove it scientifically. Science, of course, answers the questions how and when. It doesn't answer the question who and why. I've got a little visual aid. Believe it or not, this is a cake. And if I was to take this cake to the top cake scientists in the world, cakeologists, I think they're called, and they would be able to tell me, I think, how it was made. They'd probably be able to tell me what it's made of, and maybe even they'd be able to tell me when it was made. But they would not be able to tell me who made it and why it was made. Only the maker can reveal that, actually. Now, as it happened, I actually made this cake. It's not a great cake, but I'm quite proud of it. Partly as a visual aid and partly for my wonderful small group over there. But science is so important. It reveals how things happened and when, but it doesn't tell us who and why. And the questions who and why are a matter of faith, actually. It takes just as much faith to be an atheist as it does to be a Christian, because you can't prove that there is no God scientifically, just as you can't prove that there is a God scientifically. It's a matter of looking at the evidence. And I want to look at historical evidence. Scientific evidence is not the only kind of evidence. For lawyers, historical evidence is hugely important. That's what you put before a jury. Every time a jury go out to consider their verdict, guilty or not guilty, they're relying on historical evidence. They weren't there at the time the events happened, and they have to take a step of faith. Every time they bring back a verdict, they have to take a step of faith based on the evidence they've heard. And I myself could not be a Christian if it needed a blind leap of faith without any evidence. For me, it's a question of taking a step of faith based on good historical evidence about the life, the death, and in particular, the resurrection of Jesus. But sometimes people say, well, and you might be thinking, whoa, hang on a second. Like, why are we suddenly talking about Jesus? I don't even believe there's a God. And I understand that. It might seem like putting the cart before the horse. But what I want to suggest is that if I want to know you, I can find out a certain amount about you from looking at you, from studying you, from watching you. But I can actually only really know you if you choose to reveal yourself to me. And it's the same with God. We can only know God if he chooses to reveal himself to us. And the claim of the New Testament is that God has done that. And he's done it kind of in a way that you might expect, or which makes sense. Because if God is going to reveal himself to us as humans, what's the logical way to do that? It's to become a human being. And for me, it's actually the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus that convinces me that this world has a creator, and that creator is to be viewed through the lens of Jesus. So what's the evidence? How do we know, for example, that Jesus even existed? Well, the answer is we do know that Jesus existed. There's overwhelming historical evidence that Jesus existed, and no secular historian would dispute that. So first of all, outside the New Testament, the Roman historian Tacitus talks directly about Jesus. The Roman historian Suetonius talks indirectly about Jesus. The first century Jewish historian Josephus Flavius says this. He says, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it's lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles." And then he goes on to talk about his crucifixion and his alleged resurrection. So there's evidence outside the New Testament that Jesus existed. But more important, there's evidence inside the New Testament. And some say, well, the New Testament was written a very long time ago. How do we know that what they wrote has not been changed over the years? And the answer is that we do know very accurately through the science of textual criticism what the original writers wrote. And essentially the way this works is the more manuscripts we have and the closer in time they are to the original, the more sure we can be about the original. So we've just got a few examples for you. Herodotus and Thucydides were both written in the 5th century BC. The earliest copy we have is AD 900. And there's a 1,300-year time lapse, and we have 8 copies of each. And no classical scholar would doubt their authenticity. Tacitus, there's a 1,000-year time gap, and we have 20 copies. Caesar's Gallic War, 950 years, 9 to 10 copies. Livy's Roman History, a 900-year gap, and 20 copies. When it comes to the New Testament, it is unique amongst ancient documents, both for the sheer number of manuscripts and the closeness of time to the original. The New Testament was written between 40 and 100 AD. We have manuscript evidence as early as AD 130 and full manuscripts by AD 350. And we have 5,309 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin manuscripts, and 9,300 others. And that's why the classical scholar F.J. Hort, who's an expert in these things, said that in the variety and fullness on which it rests, the text of the New Testament stands absolutely and unapproachably alone amongst ancient prose writings. And again, no secular historian would disagree with that conclusion. So we know from evidence inside and outside the New Testament that Jesus existed. But who is he? Well, we know he was fully human. He had a human body. He ate, he drank, he sweated, he got tired, he suffered pain. He had human emotions, love, joy, sadness. He had human experiences. He had the experience of growing up in a family, of education, of having a job, of being tempted, of bereavement, of being tortured, and even the experience of death. And many people today would say, well, okay, say he was a human being, but he was only a human being. Maybe he was a great religious teacher, but no more than that. So what evidence is there to suggest that Jesus was any more than a great religious teacher? Well, there are two parts to this argument, really, because the first part is, who did Jesus think he was? Now, if Jesus didn't think he was any more than a human being, a great religious teacher, that is pretty much the end of the argument. And some people do say, Jesus never went around claiming to be God. And it's true, he didn't go around with a t-shirt on saying, I am God. But when you look at everything he taught and said, I think there's little doubt he was conscious of being a man whose identity was God. And that's the first part of the argument. And then the second part of the argument is, was he right? What evidence is there to support his claims? So what did he say about himself? Well, the teaching of Jesus was centered on himself. Most great religious teachers, they point away from themselves. They say, don't look at me, look at God. Jesus, in pointing people to God, pointed people to himself. He said, it's through me that you come into a relationship with God. And I don't know if you've ever experienced this sense that I have had, that even though I have a lot of good things in my life that should satisfy me, there's something missing. I found I needed to find an answer to the question, what is the ultimate meaning of life? Even with all the other things, the good things I put into my life, I always wanted more. I had like this spiritual hunger. And Jesus said, I'm the bread of life. If you come to me, that hunger will be satisfied. And that's what I found. And then there's the stuff in my life that I don't like, the bad habits, the stuff I actually find very addictive. Jesus said, if the Son, talking about himself, sets you free, if Jesus sets you free, you'll be free indeed. And that's also my experience. Jesus has set me free from all sorts of things, like a really bad temper. And some things it's been straight away, and some things it's been a bit of a longer process. And then there's stuff like guilt, fear, worry, and anxiety. I wonder if you've experienced what I've experienced when you've had one of those weeks at work where you feel completely out of your depth, and then you make a mistake, and then you find yourself awake at 2 o'clock in the morning, just thinking to yourself, is this going to be okay? And Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. You'll find peace. Jesus said, if you receive me, you receive God. If you welcome me, you welcome God. If you have seen me, you've seen God. And I don't know about you, but we've probably all come across people in our lives who maybe haven't been blessed with a huge amount of modesty or humility. They seem to think they're God's gift to the world. And if you ask them, what does God look like? They'd probably think they only have to look in the mirror to find out. I mean, maybe you've got a boss like that. Or an ex. But Jesus didn't have a trace of arrogance in his nature. And yet he said, if you want to know what God looks like, look at me. So firstly, his teaching was centered on himself. Secondly, his indirect claims. Jesus put himself in a position which only God could be in. For example, Jesus said to people who he had never met before in his life, your sins are forgiven. And the lawyers said to him, wait a minute, to forgive those who've sinned against others, that's something that only God can do. Who do you think you are? And Jesus said, I've come to die for your sins, to make forgiveness possible. Right at the heart of Christianity is forgiveness. To be a Christian is to forgive the inexcusable in others, because God has forgiven the inexcusable in me. And then the third piece of evidence is his direct claims, if you like. And I don't have time to look at all of them, but let's just look at one. And if someone ever says to you, Jesus never claimed to be God, and you've only got time to show them one verse, show them this one. And the background is that a claim, tantamount to a claim to be God, was viewed as blasphemy in the eyes of the religious leaders. And it was considered worthy of death by stoning. And Jesus said this in John 10:30. He said, I and the Father are one. And again they picked up stones to stone him. Then Jesus said to them, I've shown you many great miracles from the Father. For which of these do you stone me? We're not stoning you for any of these, they replied, but for blasphemy, because you, a mere human being, claim to be God. Those who were around him, those who heard him, those who opposed him, said, you're claiming to be God. They were in no doubt about what he was claiming, and they said he deserved to die for it. So that's the evidence that Jesus claimed that he was God. And it seems quite strong. But obviously that's a remarkable claim, and it needs to be tested. And it seems to me there are three possibilities. The first is that it wasn't true, and he knew it was untrue. In which case he was an imposter, he was a fraudster, and he was an evil one at that. The second possibility is that it wasn't true, but he really didn't realize it. He genuinely thought he was God, even though he wasn't, and we would call someone like that deluded or insane. But the only other logical possibility is that it was true. C.S. Lewis put it like this: a man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said wouldn't be a great moral teacher. He'd either be insane or else he'd be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else he's insane or something worse. But don't let us come up with any nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He hasn't left that open to us. He didn't intend to. So was Jesus right in what he claimed? What evidence is there to support what he said? Well, the first thing to look at is his teaching. The teaching of Jesus is widely acknowledged to be the greatest teaching of all time. Love your neighbor as yourself. Do to others as you would have them do to you. And then this, completely revolutionary. He was the first person to say it. Love your enemies. Jesus' teaching has been the foundation of really our entire civilization in the West. Many of our laws were originally based on the teaching of Jesus. And then think about this. We've advanced in every field of science. Just think about the technological advancements, even of the last 10 years. But in 2,000 years, no one's improved on the moral teaching of Jesus. They're the greatest words ever spoken. They're the sort of words you'd expect God to speak. And then his life, the things that he did. People sometimes say, Christianity's boring, but it certainly wouldn't have been boring being around Jesus. I just want you to imagine for a moment that you're facing a really serious moral dilemma at work. And you've got one phone call. Which of your friends do you phone? Just picture that person in your mind now. Your go-to, stand-up, serious, friend who you can rely on to give trusted advice at your hour of need. Picture that person. And then I want you to imagine you've had great news. It's a Friday night. You want to celebrate. You want to go hard on the town. You've got one call. Who's your go-to party friend, the person you would phone? Just picture those two people. I don't know about you, but for me, they're very different people. I would never want to get them mixed up. It would get very messy. I'd phone for career advice and end up in a nightclub in Shoreditch at 4 a.m. But what I find fascinating is not only that Jesus had the greatest moral teaching of all time, but he went to a party and the wine ran out. And so he says, well, you see those stone jars over there? Fill them up with 20 or 30 gallons of bathwater each and start pouring them out for the guests. And they did, and it was the best wine of the night. Jesus was the one who kept the party going. And that might surprise you. But not just his miracles, his love for the loveless, his love for people whose society had written off, the outcasts, and the way he set people free and still sets people free today. That's one of the things I most love about Jesus, the way he sets people free from all sorts of things. And of course, I suppose ultimately his death, laying down his life for his friends. And then his character. The character of Jesus has impressed millions of people who would never call themselves Christians. Time magazine said this: Jesus is the most persistent symbol of purity, selflessness, and love in the history of Western humanity. His enemies could find no fault with him, and his friends who knew him very well said, this guy is without sin. But as I'm sure you know, the real test of character is what you're like when you're seriously under pressure, when you are out of depth at work and people are screaming at you, when that relationship in which you placed all your trust and hope seems like it's falling apart. And when Jesus was being tortured, he said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And then there's his fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. No one else in the history of humanity has had a whole collection of books written about them even before they were born. Jesus fulfilled over 300 Old Testament prophecies spoken by different voices over hundreds of years, 29 of them in a single day. And some might say, well, okay, but maybe Jesus was a clever conman. You know, he read the Old Testament, he thought, I'll go out and I'll do some of these prophecies. But it doesn't work, not only because of the sheer number of them, but because there were so many over which he simply had no control. There were prophecies about the exact manner of his death, about the place of his burial, even about the place of his birth. And imagine Jesus, picking up the Old Testament, looking through it, saying, oh, goodness, I'm supposed to be born in Bethlehem. He's too late. But he was born in Bethlehem, something he had no control over. And then by far the most important is his conquest of death. The physical resurrection from the dead of Jesus is the cornerstone of Christianity. And it's so relevant to every one of us here. Every one of us is going to die. I feel a bit awkward bringing that up on a Wednesday night. But it's true. It's the ultimate statistic, isn't it? 1 in 1 of us in this room is going to die. And you might have noticed in the media when a famous person dies, even in tragic circumstances, it's kind of reported, and then quite quickly we move on to talking about what an awesome person they were. It's almost like we can't sit with the reality of death for more than a second. We don't like to talk about death. The Victorians didn't like to talk about sex, but they loved to talk about death. We love to talk about sex, but we don't like to talk about death. I even heard of a hospital where they've forbidden the use of the word death. They have a much more politically correct way of speaking about it. They talk about a negative patient care outcome. But the fact is, we die. And I will never forget going to the funeral of my dear friend Jamie, who died in really tragic circumstances. And you go there and you see his coffin and you see it being lowered into the ground, and it looks so final. It looks like the end. And it is the end. Unless death has been conquered. And that's the claim of the New Testament, that Jesus died and he was buried, and on the third day he was raised to life. And that means it's possible for each one of us to have eternal life. And that's an extraordinary claim, and it's the reason for hope at every funeral. But is it true? I mean, that's what matters. Just because it's a nice thing to believe doesn't make it true. So why do I believe that Jesus rose from the dead? Well, I hadn't realized how much evidence there is for the physical resurrection of Jesus. And there are 4 reasons why I believe that he rose from the dead. First of all, no one has ever really explained how Jesus' body was absent from the tomb on Easter Day. Some people say, well, the authorities took the body, but that's not very likely, is it? If they'd taken the body, all they had to do when people were running around going, Jesus is alive, he's risen from the dead, was to go, no, he's not. Here he is, we've got him. Others have said, well, maybe the disciples stole the body. And then they began a rumor that Jesus had been resurrected. But the tomb was guarded. And it's also psychologically improbable. I mean, here is a depressed, disillusioned group of people. Think of what they had to go through for their beliefs. Why would the disciples have been willing to be tortured and die for something that they would have known if they'd taken the body was not true? And some say, well, maybe robbers stole the body. But that's the least likely of all, because I haven't actually talked about the empty tomb, because the tomb wasn't empty. Jesus' body was absent. When the disciples got to the tomb, they found the grave clothes, which were the only valuable thing, the only thing which was worthwhile the robbers taking. They had collapsed like a caterpillar's cocoon when the butterflies emerged. And the headpiece that had been around Jesus' head had been folded up and placed in a separate place. And when they saw that, they believed. And the second reason I believe Jesus rose from the dead is not only was Jesus absent from the tomb, he was present with people. He was seen by many people on different occasions. And sometimes people say, well, maybe that's a hallucination. And yeah, people do hallucinate. The kind of people who hallucinate are highly strung, imaginative people, those who are on drugs. But among Jesus' disciples, you had Thomas, who was the ultimate skeptic. You had tough, gritty fishermen. You had Matthew, the tax collector. Tax collectors do not hallucinate. But in any event, it's highly unlikely that even two people will have the same hallucination. Jesus appeared on 11 separate occasions. On one occasion to more than 500 people at the same time. 500 people could not have the same hallucination. And then the third reason I believe Jesus rose from the dead is the immediate impact. Here were a group of disciples who were discouraged, depressed, fearful, hiding, and something occurred that totally changed them, so that 3 days after his death, they were going around telling everyone, we've seen Jesus. Jesus is alive. And then you get this historical phenomenon we know about, which is the birth and growth of the Christian church. And it's an extraordinary phenomenon without parallel really in the history of the world, because beginning with a group of basically fishermen and tax collectors, there is this explosion in 300 years right across the whole known world. It's a story of peaceful revolution with no parallel. And the fourth reason I believe Jesus rose from the dead is the sheer number of people's lives who have been transformed by Jesus. More people now than ever before. Tens of thousands of people a day are placing their trust in Jesus. Today there are 2,300,000 Christians in the world, all testifying to an experience of Jesus and an encounter with Jesus. We have Christian experience down the ages, and it's countless millions of people who have experienced the risen Jesus Christ. People of every ethnicity, every continent, every nationality, every economic, social, and intellectual background, from all walks of life, they unite in this common experience of the risen Jesus. So when I look at Jesus' claims, what he said about himself, who he said he was, his teaching, his life, the fulfillment of prophecy, his resurrection from the dead, to say he was evil or deluded, it just seems unbelievable and illogical. So I'm left with the only other option. When I look at those things, they give the strongest possible support to Jesus being a man whose identity was God. But there is all the difference in the world between head knowledge and heart knowledge. I can be convinced of something in my head without it making its way to my heart. And when I placed my trust in Jesus, that knowledge made its way from my head to my heart. Jesus said, I've come so that you might have life and life in all its fullness. And I've had my ups and downs. I've been through difficulties, and I have messed up more times than I care to remember. I am far from perfect. But I have experienced what Jesus promised. It really is true that God has revealed himself in Jesus. Jesus really is who he claimed to be. Jesus really did rise from the dead. There is hope beyond this life. There is hope in this life. Right now, in an encounter with Jesus, we find life and life in all its fullness. And that's my experience of what Jesus came to bring. And that's why I believe he is who he claimed to be.